and I hope you'll be able to at least see them from where you're sitting at home. Sound video people tell me that you definitely can. So this first picture was taken in what it was downtown Corinth, and you can kind of see it's a raised platform. In downtown Corinth in Paul's day, in fact, it's very likely that the Apostle Paul had his own little tent-making shop just a few hundred yards from where this photo was taken. And in downtown Corinth, this raised platform was called a bema. And a bema was really like, in a lot of ways, like the county courthouse. It was where if you were charged with some crime or some offense, you would be brought to this bema, and the judge would be brought out, and the charges would be read, and you'd be put on trial, and you'd be either found guilty or innocent. In Acts chapter 18, you could read the story of when the Apostle Paul was brought up on charges in Corinth, and the Apostle Paul stood on this very spot, and he was accused of really just causing trouble. That was really what the accusations were. He was disrupting the peace. Now, in Paul's case, the charges were thrown out, and if you want the legal reason, they were thrown out on questions of jurisdiction. And so the charges were dropped, but immediately after that happened, a riot breaks out, again, on this very spot. And a man, the head of the synagogue there, who was a close friend of Paul's, was beaten probably within an inch of his life. Now, the other thing is, at the end of, so that's what this bema was. This was the county courthouse. It was a place of a riot. It was a place where Paul was put on trial. The second picture I'm going to show you is taken at the far end of this bema, this raised platform. There's a plaque there today. And again, this is a little harder to see because the words are etched into the stone, and it's maybe a little hard to make out. There's the same, it's the text from our passage of Scripture this morning, 2 Corinthians 4, verses 8 through 10, and it's carved into stone there, both in Greek and in English, where it talks about being persecuted and perplexed and struck down and carrying the death of Jesus around in our bodies. And it's a way of reminding people that visit this spot of the Apostle Paul's ministry and the many hardships that he had faced, but also the way that Paul was able to endure and to persevere through adversity and through hardship and through even the greatest time of testing and trial. And that's what our text is about. That's what we've been looking at these last couple of weeks. How do we face suffering and adversity in our world today, whether that be illness or sickness or disease, or maybe this whole coronavirus pandemic? How do we keep on going in the midst of this? And I want to look from our text this morning, I want to point us really to three things. I first want to flesh out why Paul shows us that we need hope. What is it about our condition that makes hope such a necessity for us? And then we're going to look at how is God working right now, right in the present moment when you're in the midst of hard, difficult times? What is God doing right then and there? And then finally, what does God promise to do in the future that gives us hope? Now, if you look at verse 7, Paul begins by saying, we have this treasure in jars of clay. And right there, Paul is beginning to explain, and he's beginning to express to us something about our own condition that makes hope such a necessity. He calls us jars of clay. Now, I think it's important to flesh out a little bit of the context, because Paul was writing to a church, the church in Corinth, and the church in Corinth was, in a lot of ways, was very skeptical of the Apostle Paul. In their minds, Paul wasn't quite as good as some of the other preachers or teachers of his day. Paul hadn't been with Jesus during Jesus' earthly ministry. Paul wasn't as rhetorically polished as some of the other teachers and speakers, especially in Greco-Roman times when rhetoric and logic were so highly admired. Paul was kind of an ordinary guy in a lot of ways. Now, you and I today, we don't see it that way, but that's how Paul was perceived among the Corinthians. And so Paul has a credibility problem in Corinth. And so what does Paul do? When he responds to that, it's actually surprising. There's a way in which he agrees with his critics. He doesn't try to pull out his resume. He doesn't get out his LinkedIn profile and say, "Here, look at all the things that I've done and look at all my degrees and my education." He could have done that, but he doesn't. Instead, he actually agrees. He says, "Yeah, we are jars of clay. We're fragile, vulnerable, susceptible, we're weak, brittle people. Ordinary people," right? He affirms that. Now the thing, I brought that clay pot, I showed it to the kids, I'll maybe bring it out again. I bought this in Corinth, actually, because Corinth was known for its pottery, right? Corinth in that time was actually world famous for producing clay pots, and so Paul knows his audience. And of course, the thing about clay pots, as I said to the kids, that clay pots are very breakable. They're fragile. They crack easily. And Paul's whole point in that is that when God calls someone, and in Paul's case he'd be saying when God calls someone into ministry, he doesn't call the cream of the crop, he doesn't call the elite, he doesn't call the people who already have it all together. God often calls people who are weak and vulnerable, people who have their faults and their shortcomings. And that's true not just of God's calling of people into ministry, it's true of when God calls people to himself, isn't it? Right? You and I, when you think of who are the people that God calls people who have real stubborn streaks. He calls people who have tempers, and they often have to go back and apologize to those that they hurt when they lash out at them. He calls people who have weaknesses in all kinds of ways. Right? God's people are not people who are on their own strong and have it all together. God's people, the people that God calls, are clay pots. People with weaknesses and struggles and shortcomings and failures. Now Paul goes on in verses 8 through 10, and he describes his missionary experience. He describes, and you can read through the book of Acts, and you can find lots of examples of each one of these qualities that Paul talks about. He says that actually we're hard pressed, we're perplexed, we're persecuted, we're struck down. And if you follow through Paul's missionary journeys, you find plenty of examples of all these. Plenty of examples where Paul's message was met with complete laughter and ridicule. Where at times where Paul invested himself and he ministered and he preached and nobody responded except for maybe one or two people. You find times when Paul is arrested and he's put in jail and he's accused falsely of things. He's beaten. He experiences, shipwrecks. Paul's ministry is described so well here in verses 8 through 10. Right? Following the call of Jesus in your life as Paul does leads to all these things. But you know what? You don't need to follow the call of Jesus into ministry to experience these things. The simple fact is if you commit to Jesus Christ, you surrender your life to Him, and you commit to following and obeying Him, you will experience all these things and more. The calling to follow Jesus is not a call to an easy and a comfortable life. You might be, maybe you sense that God is having you care for an elderly parent, because when God says honor your parents, you believe that carries over through your whole life. And so you invest your life into caring for your parent who's elderly, and that takes a lot of time and energy. And sometimes they respond to you with nothing but criticism and anger. And so following and doing God's will in that situation can leave you very discouraged. It can leave you very with hurt feelings. You wonder, what is this all worth? What is it all for? You invest yourself in the life of the poor because you believe that God cares for those who are poor and on the margins of society, and you spend time helping them, and you want to mentor them, and you find that you, in spite of all the advice you're giving them, all the help they're giving, they don't listen, and you find yourself frustrated, and you're throwing up your hands in despair, and you're saying, why? I'm trying to help someone, and it's all coming to naught. And if that weren't enough, you go a little further, and Paul summarizes in verse 16. He says, outwardly we are wasting away. Right? So not only are we clay pots, who are, we've got our shortcomings and our weaknesses and our frailties, not only is following Jesus costly, but also Paul just acknowledges the simple reality that we are outwardly wasting away. Now, you know what? American culture, Western culture in general, spends billions of dollars every year to deny what Paul is saying here in verse 16. We spend billions of dollars to color our hair, to keep it from being gray. We spend billions of dollars on wrinkle cream and trying to make us look young. And by the way, I'm not singling you out if you use any of those things. It's really not the point. The point is that we actually try to deny in so many ways the reality that we grow older and we wear out and we break down and we deal with illness. We are all, as Paul says, outwardly wasting away. Now, if you're beginning to hear this, you're beginning to feel, I think, the weight of what the reality Paul is describing, right? We're clay pots with our frailties and our weaknesses. God calls us to follow Him not into a life of comfort and ease, but into a life that is difficult, a life of obedience that is often challenging. And physically, we are all wasting away. Now, that's the bad news. Where's the good news? What's the hope here? And as I said before, there's something that God is doing right now in the midst of it all, and there's something we have yet to look forward to. Now, look again at verses 8 through 10. I'm not going to read it all again, but this is that list of things that Paul describes, all the hardship that he faces. It's interesting, what Paul is doing there is he's borrowing a literary form that was common in Greco-Roman times, especially among a school of philosophers known as the Stoics. It's called a catalog of sufferings. That's what they called it. Now, some of you, maybe you have your own catalog of sufferings that you like to recite, but Paul is he's kind of going through this list of sufferings because what people did in those days, especially this group of philosophers known as the Stoics, is they would describe all the hardships that they'd gone through in their entire life. So maybe they start off saying, my dad died when I was young, and my mom, she was afflicted with an illness, and then I got sick, and then, my teacher didn't call on me when I had my hand up in school, and they have a whole long list of all the hardships that they'd endured. But the point of it at the end for the Stoics was to say, but I mastered it all. I was tough. I didn't shed a tear. See, in the Stoic way of thinking, in fact, I bring this up because this carries over to today. In the Stoic way of thinking, the whole point of facing suffering was to be strong and tough and to overcome it. Don't show your weakness. Don't show that you're hurting. Just be tough. Now, Paul's response is different. Paul and Christianity in general actually are very honest about the pain of this world. We acknowledge that this world is not the way it's supposed to be. It's a world of hardship and pain and sadness. We can be really honest about that. We don't need to deny it. We don't need to pretend that it's just an illusion, as other religions try to suggest. Right? But what God is, we acknowledge the pain, but look at what Paul says in the second part of verse 7. He says, we have the treasure in jars of clay. Why? To show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Did you hear that? Did you hear what Paul is saying there? The whole point of adversity and pain and hardship, the whole point of our weakness and our frailty is to be a magnifying glass for the power of God. When you are at your weakest, when you are most vulnerable, when you come to the end of your resources, well, guess what? That is where God is working most powerfully. That's where you realize you don't have it in you. You don't have the resources to face this on your own. But that is meant to point you to the fact that God is the one who's working in you. Your grief, your disappointment, your discouragement, your feelings of helplessness are exactly the place where God meets you. Those are the events and the circumstances that are meant to magnify the power of God. And furthermore, if you look at verses 10 through 12, Paul puts it a little differently. He says, we who are alive are being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that His life may be revealed in our mortal body. Death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. What Paul is saying there is that when we become a believer, when you become a Christian, then we become joined to Jesus. We become united with Christ both in His death and in His resurrection. Now, I'll explain more what that means in just a moment, but just know for a moment that the context here is pointing us to the fact that what Paul is saying is, I'm suffering all of this. I'm going through all this hardship and adversity. I'm being brought up on false charges, and I'm being beaten and accused and put in jail. And I'm doing that so that you, Corinthians, might believe the gospel, so that God's work might be accomplished among you. But if you step back a little bit, you see kind of a bigger picture, which is that idea that in Christ we are, or through by faith in Jesus Christ, we are joined to Jesus, and both in his death and in his resurrection. In other words, to be a Christian is to carry around in you both the death and life of Jesus. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means dying to self. Being a Christian means that God is putting to death in you your old sinful nature. We read about that earlier this morning in our service from Colossians 3. Right? To be joined to Jesus means we take that old sinful, selfish, self-centered person, and that person dies with Jesus on the cross. That person has died and must continue to die. Why? So that the life of Jesus might be more and more put on display in us. Paul says in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, he says, I've been crucified with Christ. I don't live anymore, but Christ lives in me. Whatever you are going through this morning, whatever kind of hardship you may be facing, whether it's maybe it's not anything major or significant, maybe it is. But this is the message of hope for you. Jesus is living in you. He is working in you to display his power and his presence. In our sufferings, in our pain, in our hardship, Jesus lives in you. You carry the life of Jesus in you. Now that's not all. There's one final thing that I want us to see. That's what God is doing in the present. But Paul goes on, he also points us to something that God promises to do in the future. Look at verse 14. We know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus from the dead will also raise us up with Jesus and present us with you in his presence. That is Paul's hope. Now, I think it's really important to be very clear on what hope is. Because today we use hope, and we don't always use it in the same sense that the Bible is using it. We often use hope, and what we really are meaning is optimism. So, so if you say, I hope it's going to be warm this week, well, you're really just wanting it to be warm this week. And if you say, well, I hope, your favorite sports team wins the championship, well, that's just something you want to happen. That's optimism. But most of the time, you don't have really any basis for that. I mean, maybe to a greater or lesser degree. If you say, I hope it's warm this week, you might look at a weather report and say, oh, yeah, it looks like it might be warm. I hope it is. You have some degree of confidence. If you say, if I say, I hope the Oilers win the Stanley Cup this year, I really have no basis for that. It would be nice, but there's no reason to think that it will happen. It's optimism. And optimism is a fine trait. It's a fine quality, but it's not hope. Biblical hope is confidence in God's promises about the future that shapes how you live in the present. Did you catch that? Let me say it again. Biblical hope is confidence in God's promises about the future that shape how you live in the present. So, for example, let's say you're having a crummy day, you go to work and the people that you work with just are harsh or critical towards you. Maybe you don't land the account that you were hoping to make, or maybe you're staying at home and your kids are just, they're tired and they're grumpy and they're making you tired and grumpy and worn out, or whatever else it might be going. If in those moments of real discouragement or weariness or frustration, if all of a sudden you remember, hey, tonight my grandkids are coming over for dinner, or next weekend my wife and I get to go away for a few days, just the two of us. All of a sudden that the reality of the future begins to lift your spirits in the present. It kind of gives you a little boost of energy and a little boost of endurance. So you say, well, this isn't so easy right now, but I know what's coming. That is biblical hope. Now look again at verse 14 where Paul describes the hope. He says, we know that the one who raised Jesus from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you in his presence. The hope of the gospel is that one day you and I will be presented before the Lord Jesus Christ in perfection, made whole, body, mind, and spirit. God's ultimate goal for us is to present us perfectly in His presence, perfected, stripped away of all sins and shortcomings and weaknesses, stripped away from bodies that are wasting away and minds that are wasting away, stripped away of all the things that outwardly are wasting away, and present us as those who have been renewed inwardly. That is the gospel promise. And when you believe that, when you have confidence in that, that shapes how you live in the present. How? Well, let me show you two ways. The first is in verse 17. Paul says, outwardly, we're wasting away. Inwardly, we're being renewed. Then he goes on, and for our light and momentary troubles. Now, let's pause there for a moment. Light and momentary troubles. And there are some of you that want to stand up right now and say, wait a minute. Paul, how can you call my experience light? Right? If you're dealing with cancer, if you're facing uncertainty about your job or layoffs or financial insecurity, or if your world is falling apart, your family is falling apart, how can you say that is light? And Paul's answer to that comes when he says that it's a little later in verse 17. They're achieving for us an eternal glory that outweighs them all. See, the only way that our trials in the moment can be counted as light is when you sort of put them on the scale next to eternity. You know, if you just look at this present moment and you talk about your loss of a job, or you talk about the illness or the disease or the grief or the hardship, whatever, it's enormous. But it's only when you put it on the scale and you recognize that eternity is something far greater and far more glorious. That's how Paul can say it's light and momentary. It's only light and momentary when you count it next to eternity. And what Paul is emphasizing here is that whatever you are going through, whatever hardship in this world, as painful as it may be today, it's nothing in light of eternity. And that then brings us to the second thing, because Paul says our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us. In other words, the hardship you are going through is doing something for you. It's not random. It's not pointless. It's not. It didn't happen without God's knowledge or His awareness. It happened in the sovereign will of God, and it happened in such a way that God will actually take and turn around whatever hardship happens to us, whatever disappointments or griefs or loss, and He will do something with it. He is preparing you and me for eternity. Now, we don't always understand the what and the when and the how right now. Right? We talked about that a couple weeks ago when we looked at Habakkuk. No, you don't always understand what God is doing. Of course you don't. But that doesn't mean God isn't doing something. God is using these hardships to prepare you for an eternal glory. And so that's why Paul says, hold on to this. Hold on to this. Fix your eyes. Don't fix your eyes on the things you can see. Don't fix your eyes on all that's happening in the world today. Don't let that be your guide in terms of understanding what's happening and why, but fix your eyes on what's eternal. Look towards what is into eternity. Hold fast to it at all costs. Cling to that promise. Cling to that assurance. I'm going to close with one more picture. Some of you might recognize this photo. It's taken at Corban University here in town. It's kind of an art installation just outside of the Psalm Center, the auditorium there. You can't really see the whole picture very well, but what you see is a progression of stones. On the very bottom is a large boulder, and it's pretty clear that it's not much has been done to it. It's large, it's rough. You go a little higher, it's actually a little smaller, but it's a little more polished off, and so on. The top boulder is really hard to see, and it's actually not really a boulder, but it's been perfectly smoothed out. It's perfectly round. And there's a little plaque next to that as well. I didn't take a picture of that, but the little plaque says that the inspiration for this piece of artwork was from 1 Corinthians 15, where it talks about the hope of the resurrection, where Paul says that in this world we have bodies that break down and wear down and decay, but God is preparing for us a perfected and glorified body. And that's why at the top, as you ascend towards the heavens, you have this perfected stone. Hold fast to that hope. Whatever adversity you find yourself in today, whatever hardship, whatever discouragement, maybe it's family, maybe it's work-related, maybe it's financial, maybe it's personal. hold fast to the hope. We are clay pots. That's true. But God displays His glory and His power in us to point us to Him and to help us see that God is preparing us for eternity. So fix your eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporal, but what is unseen is eternal. Let's pray. Father, there are some of us today who actually are feeling very keenly the pain of this world. We're coping with disease or illness. We're very aware that our bodies are wearing out and breaking down. Lord, some of us are dealing with the effects that come with aging. Some of us are aware of our own personal struggles and shortcomings and our weaknesses. Lord, we are clay pots, but you have displayed your glory in us. You have entrusted us with the gospel. You've called us to be your own, and you promise that throughout this life, until the day we see you face to face, you are working in us something that is eternal. You are working in us a glory that will far, far, far outweigh anything that we may experience today. Help us to hold fast to this. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's much easier to look around at what is seen, but help us to fix our eyes on what is unseen. Help us to have a vision for the eternal. In Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. I invite you to respond. We're going to be singing a song that's a little bit newer to us this morning, but it's a song that so well professes the hope that we have. So let's join in singing this song this morning.